Hello good people and welcome back to another Parry This American History video. Today's topic is Anne Hennis Trotter Bailey, better known as Mad Ann Bailey. She was a scout and Indian fighter who became famous for her exploits on the American frontier in the late 1700s. There are many tall tales surrounding this iconic American legend, some of which undoubtedly contain at least a nugget of truth. But one thing is certain, and that is that Anne Bailey's legacy has extended far past her native home of Virginia and has become engraved into American folklore. Today I will be stripping away as much of the fanciful tales as I possibly can, and will be presenting you with just the historical account of this famous woman's life. Anne Hennis was born in 1742 in Liverpool, England. She was reportedly named after Queen Anne of England, who was the monarch when her father fought at the Battle of Blenheim. Anne was formally educated in England, where she learned to read and write. In 1761, when Anne was about 19, the last of her parents died. It is not certain whether it was her father or mother who was the last to survive, as neither of their names are recorded. However, it was at this time that Anne would leave England and come to the American colonies. Like many people at the time, she did not actually have any money, and so she paid for her transit to the colonies by selling herself as an indentured servant for a term of 4 years. She arrived in the Virginia colony in mid to late 1761, and began her new life in Staunton, Virginia, where she lived with distant relatives who had immigrated here many years prior. It is likely that it was to these whom she had become an indentured servant. There is little record of what happened to her during these years, but it is likely that given her status and education, she worked as a cook or housekeeper until 1765, when she would marry her first husband at the age of 23. Her first husband's name was Richard Trotter, and she would now be known as Anne Trotter. Anne's first husband, Richard, was a British soldier serving in the Royal Virginia Militia under the command of General Edward Braddock. This militia would be called upon by the royal governor of the Virginia colony, Lord Dunmore, to move against a fort held by the French in British territory. In 1755, General Braddock would lead an expedition against the French and their Indian allies, which would end in disaster. They would be ambushed and General Braddock would be shot and killed, leaving a young Colonel George Washington to take command and lead the surviving British forces away in retreat. Richard Trotter was among these men and survived this expedition. In 1767, 2 years after their marriage, Richard and Anne would have a son, who would be named William Trotter. He would be born in their home near Barber, Virginia. The young couple would live here in relative peace and happiness for several years, which would see Anne living domestically as a mother and Richard serving in the Virginia militia. Then on October 10th, 1774, Richard would take part in and be killed in the Battle of Point Pleasant, which was the only major action of Dunmore's War, which was an armed conflict between the colony of Virginia and the Shawnee tribe. This battle would take place when the Shawnee forces under the leadership of Chief Cornstalk would attack the Virginia militia under Colonel Andrew Lewis, hoping to stop them from advancing into the Ohio Valley. The battle would be long and hard fought, and would include many casualties. The Virginians would emerge victorious, but Richard Trotter would die in this battle. After learning that she had become widowed at the age of 32, Anne would leave her young son William with her friend and neighbor Mrs. Moses Mann, and would strike out to avenge the death of her husband at the hands of the Shawnee people. Anne would dress in masculine attire, which is described as buckskin leggings, petticoats, heavy brogan shoes, a man's coat and hat, a hunting knife in a belt around her waist, and a rifle slung over her shoulder. At this time, she became a frontier scout, messenger, spy, and allegedly an Indian fighter. It was during these years that she would earn her sobriquet of Mad Ann, and would be known to the Shawnee and other tribes in the area as the White Squaw of the Kanawha. During this time, she served as a frontier scout, which in essence meant observing and reporting on the movements of American Indians in the frontier. She would have likely also ridden as a dispatch rider for the colonial forts in the area. This would mean that she would ride between settlements carrying letters and reports to the various fort commanders, and would on these trips observe and report any movements that she witnessed. She would become renowned for her riding skill and frontier skills during these years, and would allegedly go on her many famous adventures. Many of these tall tales include hiding in logs from Indians and scalping Indian warriors whom she had killed to avenge her husband, but these are likely fictionalized accounts as they have never been corroborated by any secondary historical sources. It does seem likely that during these years she killed 2 Indian warriors in self-defense on one of her journeys as a courier. During the Revolutionary War, Anne served her country notably as a recruiter for the Continental Army. She rode from town to town all over Virginia and perhaps the surrounding colonies, urging men to join the army or their local militias to protect their families from the Indian raiders to the west and the foreign tyrant to the east. It is said that she saw much success during these years and convinced a great many men to volunteer for service in the army. She would ride town to town, staying at inns, drinking, swearing, and telling stories of the frontier and the Indian wars. And whether through her compelling arguments of necessity necessity or her legendary charisma, she was able to recruit more men than anyone else in the region. Needless to say, this certainly played at least somewhat of a large part in Virginia's high participation in the Revolution, and likely contributed significantly to the Continental success. Then, in 1785, at the age of 43, Anne would marry her second husband, John Bailey, and would become Anne Bailey. John Bailey was an experienced frontiersman and served as a ranger for the United States Army. The couple would remain in active service to the U.S. military and would be stationed at Fort Lee, which was named in honor of the governor of Virginia, Henry Lee, who was the father of Robert E. Lee, who would of course become famous years later in the American Civil War. The two would live here, with Anne continuing her service as a scout and courier for 3 years, until 1788, when they would move to Fort Clendenin, where they would take an active role in protecting the settlers from Indian attacks. From 1788 to 1790, Anne Bailey would act as a scout for Fort Clendenin, and would ride swiftly between there and the surrounding settlements, with her primary role being to warn the settlers of impending attacks. This would of course lead to, more often than not, a ready and waiting populace in place of a defenseless town when the surprise attack landed. During these years as a frontier scout, Anne Bailey yet again likely saved many lives, and proved an invaluable asset to the U.S. military during what would become known as the Northwestern Indian Wars. In 1791, at the age of 49, Anne Bailey would complete her arguably most famous act. In this year, Fort Lee, now known as Charleston, West Virginia, would be besieged by a large force of hostile Indians, intent on destroying the fort and its surrounding settlement. The force inside, including Anne's husband John, would hold out for some time before running low on powder and ammunition. Anne would then volunteer to make the ride to acquire the necessary ammunition for the fort, and would break through the Indian lines riding a dark black horse. She would ride over 100 miles to Savannah, at present-day Lewisburg, carrying a message from Fort Lee's commander. Here she would receive a second horse, and both horses would be loaded down with powder and shot for the soldiers at Fort Lee. She would then immediately turn around and ride straight back to Fort Lee, arriving 3 days after she had left on her 200-mile round trip. With renewed ammunition, the soldiers of Fort Lee would successfully defend themselves and emerge victorious after defeating the attacking Indians. Anne Bailey would be cited for bravery and credited with saving Fort Lee, and all those inside it. According to legend, as a reward, she was given the black horse that she had used for the ride as her reward. She would then name him Liverpool and would call him Pool for short. Anne would remain at Fort Lee with her husband John until he would die in 1794. Anne, now twice widowed at the age of 52, would remain on active duty for the Army as a scout until 1795, when the Treaty of Greenville, Ohio was signed, effectively ending the Northwest Indian War. Anne would then leave Fort Lee and move to Ohio, where she would live with her son, William, along the Kanawha River. She would live here, riding as a dispatch rider and carrying mail for the settlements in this area for 23 years, before moving yet again with her son in 1818. They would move to Gallipolis, Ohio, further west, and Anne would live by herself in a crude log cabin on her son's property. She would teach school here for 7 years until she would die on November 22, 1825, at the age of 83. It is said that she died in her sleep, surrounded by her grandchildren in front of her fireplace. She would be buried in the nearby Trotter family cemetery, where her remains would rest for 76 years, before being moved in October of 1901 to Monument Park in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, very near the place where her first husband had died in battle. And that is where we're going to end it for today. The life of Anne Bailey is certainly not as well known or documented as some people from this period in American history, and much of this is likely due to the fact that she was a woman serving in a career that was, for the most part, dominated by men. However, her contributions to early America should not be understated. Throughout the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the Northwest Indian Wars, Anne Bailey served her country and community abroad in many capacities, and even if it was in a smaller way than some, her bravery and heroism deserves to be remembered for what it was. But that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video essay and learned something from it. But in any case, thank you for watching and have a nice day, and we'll see you next time.